for that warm welcome. I think, the accolades are always, I don't know how I feel about those. But certainly it's been one journey in this economics field. I have this post-it or a little sticky note that I got from Rethinking Economics while I was at SOAS, and it says economics is too white, too old, and too male. And so every time I show up in a space, I'm reminded of the sticky note, because even in the spaces that I occupy, sometimes here in the South African sphere, as much as South Africa is in Africa, this remains consistent, right? So I'm happy to talk to you today about corruption, and really drawing from my master's thesis, and my master's thesis is important just because I studied, and I think a sort of front loading where I'm coming from to say I studied under Mushtaq Khan, and Mushtaq Khan is an economist at SOAS, who's a lecturer, a professor, and Mushtaq Khan has worked extensively on the issue of corruption, and recently has been involved in a project that thinks about anti-corruption strategies in a number of countries, including Nigeria, Bangladesh, and a number of other countries. So I really encourage people to sort of look at that work, and it's housed in the UK under DFID. So it's funded by DFID. I can never remember what DFID stands for, but I'm pretty sure people will be familiar with that agency that funds many UK research. But yeah, so just to begin to kind of share that background, because I think what I'll be sharing today, hoping to share, is a different perspective of corruption from what the mainstream dominant discourse has taught us. So I'll be going through the political economy of corruption as the first sort of discussion. My sense of economics, or how I understand economics, is that, we must always think of economics as historical, social, economic processes that are reproduced in various ways over different time periods. So it's very important that we understand, when did corruption become a major issue? Why did it become a major issue, and what were the ramifications thereof? Then we'll be defining corruption, how the IMF defines corruption, and how heterodox economists, meaning non-mainstream economists, would define it. And then we'll go into fiscal policy and corruption. Fiscal policy is sort of my expertise, and fiscal policy is basically government expenditure, if we, as a definition. And we'll talk about corruption in the time of COVID-19. And I'll leave you, I put that as what is needed, but actually I'll probably leave you with more questions than answers around this. But it's really to prompt some things about how we look forward, or how we think about corruption moving forward. So history matters, as I've said. We know that there was colonial extraction, there was violent colonial extraction. We know that, particularly on the African continent and many other countries around the world, on continents where there was colonizers, there were particular economies established. And these economies, of course, also functioned with corruption, right? When we think about the extraction in Congo, when we think about how, capitalism even began in South Africa, in many other countries, there was always corruption from the beginning of capitalism itself. And even before that, we can go back to feudalism and any historic structure. There was always been corruption, right? And I'm hoping to sort of, highlight to you when it emerges in sort of like the political discourse, the global discourse, when corruption becomes salient, so to say. So I begin here with the role of the state, because of course, when we usually talk about corruption, it's generally with regards to government. But I think I call it the role of the state because it's not just about government, it's also about how the state relates to business, right? So how does corruption manifest in the business realm, which is still within a state realm? So it's not just about government, but it's to say that there are various corrupt entities happening, but there's a particular way in which the state is seen that has produced or reduced, let's say, corruption. So political economy-wise, our countries have changed significantly. After the World War II, You know, the government was seen as a necessary prime mover. This is 1940 to 1979. A lot of our countries became, you know, independent during this period. And during this paradigm, it was actually seen that, you know, government had to be the one that would establish a new economic order, that would be entrepreneurial, that, you know, it would lead to prosperity in many countries. And so you notice that when you look at the history, most African states who became independent during this time were sort of left to, you know, organize and decide on their own policy in a way, right? Until the 70s, and I'll come to that. But during this period, you know, the global discourse, at least at the international level, and I'll say the global north particularly, is saying that, look, government is very necessary and important. And so corruption here was not necessarily a concern. Here it was about how will government correct coordination failures, how will government drive economic growth, how will government ensure that there's investment and so forth, right? And then in the 1980s in particular, you see the neoclassical counter-revolution. And so this is the beginning of sort of where the corruption discussion begins, right? So here, what happens is that there's an agreement, a global North agreement, that the state is actually the problem. Why are African countries not growing? You know, why are African countries that have been independent for so long, what's wrong with them? Of course, it must be that the government is the problem, you know? And the problem there is that it did not acknowledge that a lot of African states had been left because of the colonial capitalist structure. A lot of countries had been left with export-oriented economies, which meant that when there was a commodities, you know, what do you call it, a down, an economics down, in the late 70s, a lot of them found themselves in crisis. And it wasn't because the governments hadn't done enough, but it's because they'd inherited these export-oriented economies and structures, right, that did not benefit the majority. And they were supposed to, in a decade, change the economy for all, which of course, as you can imagine, how difficult that is. Like, how do you change a colonial structure that does not care about the people on the ground and turn that around within a 10-year, you know, 10-year period for some of them? And some of them, of course, countries like South Africa at this point, you know, not even democratic states yet. But so then the government started being seen as the problem, and neoclassical economics started to take shape. And when I say neoclassical economics, I'm talking about the state as an enabler of business, as opposed to the state as an interventionist mechanism, as a way to control and direct business initiatives in a particular way, right? So here what we're seeing is this assumption that, look, the market, which is business, is more efficient, it's better at providing goods, it's better at providing education and health. So what was told to African states, the African states were told, if you want money, because we know you're in crisis, you don't have money because the commodities aren't doing well, but if you want money, you have to agree to these sets of policies, right? And we see you as predatory, you know, and as corrupt. So actually, you're going to need to step back. You need to disinvest in education. You need to disinvest in health. You need to disinvest in all these sectors so that private sector can what? Provision them. And of course, as the current crisis shows us, those disinvestments have very high consequences. But there's a political shift about how we understand states and corruption. You know, this is where it really emerges that states, and particularly African states, are seen in a particular light, you know, because of their inability to have transformed economies in such a short period of time. So what's the state told? Step back. If you step back, there'll be less corruption, which is not true. So then you have the Washington Consensus at the time, right? And the Washington Consensus includes these things, which I've already started mentioning. Fiscal discipline, you know, because you guys are mismanaging your funds, reordering public expenditure priorities, don't spend on health, the private sector will provide health. Tax reform, reduce your taxes, remove your boards for sugar and you know, all the commodities. Liberalize interest rates, so basically enable business, right? Competitive exchange rates, liberalize trade, you know, FDI is your friend, foreign direct investment is your friend, Privatize, I mean, really, the best thing you can do is to get it off the state plate and privatize, because you are way too corrupt to be able to handle sort of these massive changes, and then deregulation and property rights. And so it's interesting, the IMF says, since much public corruption can be traced to government intervention in the economy, policies that aimed at liberalization, stabilization, deregulation, and privatization sharply reduce opportunities for behavior and corruption. Right, so that's the policy prescription, which many African countries were subject to in exchange for debts. And what this did is that it led to what is called policy externalization, right? Which means that the IMF is telling you or African countries what policies they should be implementing. So it's not based on what the African states themselves believe to be policy, right? Or should be policy for their future development. And then in the 1990s, you know, there's a slight shift. There's a more balanced view of the state. But of course, now we know that markets fail and you need state intervention. There are things that, you know, the private market is not delivering. There's been decades of poor human rights attainment. You know, there's now data that shows that because of this policy externalization, you know, what's happened is that there's been deepened inequality globally, right? Because of neoliberal policies, because there hasn't been so much focus on expenditure on health and education, because African states have been focusing on reducing the number of people working in the public sector and so forth and so forth. And so now there's a different, what is called the post-Washington consensus. And it says government actually has to be involved, right? But this is how the government needs to be involved. There needs to be what is called good governance. And so this emerges in the 90s, this idea of, you know, you need good governance, you need non-corrupt governments, you need governments that are trying to enable, and I'll go through the good governance paradigm in a bit. But this is all about, you know, improving law-abiding citizens and companies and governments, improving efficiency, public sector tackling corruption and so forth. And without really taking seriously, like I said, history matters, the history that has brought us to that moment, because at that point in time, there are systems that are in place, and I'll come to this, but to say that corruption is systematic. It is never random. It is never just one rogue person. It is a systematic issue that enables corruption. So at this point, you've already got systems in place that are enabling particular types of corruption. And so here are the principles of good governance. Oh, good governance has, you know, can fight corruption because, you know, if we all participate and, you know, government is consistent with the rule of law and is transparent, is responsive to what people are saying, citizens are saying, is consensus oriented, so kind of democracy vibes, equitable and inclusive, you know, speaks to the majority, effective and efficient and accountable, then we can get rid of corruption, right? And the biggest critique of this idea of good governance has been that it's the one size fits all. I mean, you can apply this to any country. In South Africa, do we have participatory mechanisms? Yes. Are we consistent generally with the rule of law? Yes. Is there transparent budgets? Yes. Is government responsive? Okay. But I'm pretty sure the IMF and the World Bank would say yes. Consensus oriented is a democracy. Equitable, inclusive, yes, it talks, you know, speaks largely to the majority, which is Black people. Is it effective and efficient? You know, maybe we'll get a mediocre score there. Is the government accountable? You know, also another mediocre score. But overall, people would say South Africa's got good governance, right? But does South Africa have corruption? Yes, despite what the scores might say, right? Do we go and participate in parliament and tell them that their budgets are not working for the people? Yes. Do we tell them that corruption is bleeding away at important expenditure for the people? Yes. But this is a very checklisty, you know, as you can see, the principles are very much checklist. And the good governance, you know, framework itself, and I'll come back to this in more critique, but to talk about, it fails to really understand corruption, right? It assumes there's a very dominant corruption taking place, and that these solutions in any country, anywhere, will work. If you just have these, I don't know how many things there are, like 8 maybe, you will eliminate corruption. And how many governmental states have said we will do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all these things in exchange for aid? A lot of them. How many governments say we will do this, so that we can get more debt? They say this all the time. Is there still corruption? Absolutely. And so the good governance framework in itself has not done what it aspired to do. So I'm going to stop here before I get into why this program is failing, because it doesn't understand corruption itself. But to stop here to say this is the political economy of corruption, and to really say that, it is political because there's obviously ways in which African states in particular have been painted as corrupt, whereas other countries in the global north, who might not even have all these mechanisms we're talking about here, even in good governance, are not branded as corrupt. And the double standards in the political economy of when corruption became an issue and a concern. But also what I've tried to do in this first section is link to you, to give you a link between economic policy making itself and how we understand corruption and how corruption has driven a particular economic agenda on the African continent. So I'll take questions. I think there's a lot of chats, but I can't really read them. So I don't know, Mark, if you'll be able to help.
There's a lot of chat. Let me just try to decipher some of this for you. Victoria said, I hear the IMF just creates debt traps for developing countries. The West is not interested in seeing Africa prosper. And Nigel came in and commented that he's wondering if we missed the importance of constitutional constraints by the colonialist. And he gave an example of France, who somehow got its colonies to sign some pacts that literally extend their colonialism until today. So we'd like your thoughts on that as we wait for a few more questions to come in.
Absolutely. And in the next section, I'll basically be arguing how actually wealth does not come from the north to the south. I'd argue that wealth moves from the south to the north in through many ways, and I'll go through them later. But illicit financial flows, for example, odious debt, which I'll unpack what that means. There's many ways, including that colonial undertones in many countries that still exist, that hold in various aspects, and so it will be something that I'll definitely cover, but certainly that, feminist economists in particular have argued this for a long time, that we have to understand the power relations, the power dynamic. And as I've tried to show, the IMF, the World Bank having these reins to say, you are corrupt, this is the policy you implement. That's a power dynamic, right? You don't hear South Africa going to America and saying, hey, you are corrupt, therefore you have to implement these policies. No, it's how corruption in a way has been co-opted. Is there corruption? Yes, I'll never disagree that there's no corruption, right? But how it's the issues being co-opted for a particular policy paradigm in political projects.
It's true. Victoria added, and France also still has 14 of its former colonies depositing their wealth in France. And then the African states have to apply for their own money as a loan from France. That's corruption in her book. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, there's a lot of corruption happening globally. That's one thing I can say for sure. There's a lot of, and in the next thing you'll see, I'll talk about state capture. And I think, when thinking about colonial relations, how do we think about state capture? I guess the question we have to think about, how do we think about political corruption as it relates to, former, colonialists in these various places. So certainly, I think there's many types, and I'll cover some types of corruption, but I certainly think there's many more to be explored. I think one of the questions I've always been interested in is that, lobbying in America and people donating to, openly donating to certain parties is not necessarily seen as corruption. But on the African continent, imagine if I gave one of the presidents money, like what would that look like? You know, and then there was policy. The next day you heard X countries now implementing feminist policy. Wouldn't everyone say I've corrupted the president? Absolutely, you know. So, you know, to think about the rules, I think one of the things, what defines corruption, and I'll get to this next, what defines corruption is what are the rules and how are people moving away or not following the rules? And the rules can change in any context at any day. You know, the rules can change. There are countries that have built in on their spending a proportion that will go to corruption. So they know, like, of course, this business is going to charge 10% more. And it's okay as long as they deliver the road, but we will build into it, you know, so, but then it's not against the rules. And so the question is, what are the rules and why is it that on the African continent, the departure from those rules, you know, always corruption, where's the departure in other places, because the rules are different, isn't, you know?
It's true. I have a personal question I'd like to pose at this point as well, because you did talk a lot about what I studied to be the structural adjustment program period. And I just wanted to ask you, from your perspective, do you think that the era of structural adjustment is over? Or if it's not, how close are we to being in charge of our own policy rather than being so policy external?
The short to the long is that it's not over. And the reason why it's not over, I mean, obviously, particularly during a crisis, you have to remember that crisis re-entrenches neoliberalism further, right? Because if countries are in crisis, it means they need, like, look what's happening now. I can't remember the exact number, but I think it's over 200 billion is needed for the African countries or African country responses cumulatively to COVID. Where will states find that money? Right? And so it means that they have to go to these international financial institutions, which means they have to adopt these programs, which never died to begin with, right? Conditionalities, no matter how much the IMF says it's changed its policy perspectives, I mean, it's pretty much like neoliberal reformism every time. It's like, we're gonna just alter this and just that, you know? And really to say that, yeah, like it's not over, but also then we've got other issues. So for example, in South Africa, we are, you know, our government is implementing austerity, right? Which is the cutting of budgets and implementation of regressive taxes, you know? And they explicitly say that they believe in neoclassical economics. Is it the IMF telling them to implement this? No, right? But there's also the ideological entrenchment, right? Neoclassical or neoliberal economics has entrenched itself so much in our policymakers, right? That they will, you know, and I now worry that even if the restraints are taken away, I really want the restraints taken away. But the question is, even if those restraints are taken away, will they not continue with the same policy prescriptions, right? Because again, we're now living in a hyper financialized system, which means credit ratings agencies exercise a particular control, you know, and ratings agencies will say, if you're not following neoliberal economics, that you are like negative grade, you know, so there's, the world of capitalism itself has changed, right? We are living in a very different financialized system. And I'll talk about that a bit, about how the financialized system itself actually enables corruption in a different way from what it was during colonial period, let's say. So yeah.
Thank you for that. Before we go back into this presentation, we have one question, because we did just talk about colonialism, independence, and what has happened since the 70s and 80s. But what about before? Way, way before, indigenously before? Do you have an answer to what is the indigenous economic paradigm of African people?
Oh, that's a difficult question. I mean, I don't think, one, that African people are obviously homogenous. I mean, that's the first thing. I mean, when I remember I wrote a paper on trade. And it was clear that even colonialism, before colonialism was on the African continent, of course, there were economies, always. There's always been economies, right? Like economies, I always describe this. economics or economies are just a set of decisions about how we will produce and socially reproduce as people. And this is required under any context, anywhere on time. We'll always have to produce and reproduce, right? And so different economies were organized differently, right? And the reason why I think the homogeny thing, and I see Nigel, they're saying they disagree, but I think the reason, let me give you an example of why we can't say they're homogeneous. We've got matrilineal cultures on the African continent, and we've got patrilineal cultures, right? And even within those structures, how assets move, who inherits the assets, it's different, right? And I'll give you an example. In South Africa, Zulu culture, in Malawi, Chewa culture. Chewa people, it's matrilineal, which means you inherit your mother's goods, which means assets are moving through the matrilineal lineage, and assets are critical in economics. When you look at South African Zulu culture, assets are moving through patriarchy, right? Patrilineal, rather, not patriarchy, but patrilineal lineage, which in itself is a distinction. These are economies that are premised on a different gendered paradigm about who deserves assets, who receives assets, and what kind of assets are going to be reproduced within the lineages like that. So I think, one thing I can say for sure is that trade has always existed. We know that for sure. How communities decided what to trade, what to produce, and how to produce it, that's not information that I have at my hand, right? But also, I think sometimes there's obviously a lot documented about Europe and the feudalism structure and all these historical structures of how various groups and people moved. And I think that on the African continent, there certainly are different ways in which they're moved, right? It depends. Did you depend on kings? Did you not? I do not believe in the whole Africa, every single tribe, the lives was a feudalistic one where the king owned all the land. Like, I don't think that can necessarily be true, right? We are very diverse people who've moved and are different, hunters and gatherers versus, like, there's so much happening. I mean, you could write a whole paper about the economy of hunters and gatherers themselves, which is not all African people, So I certainly think there's certainly diversity to be considered. So I don't believe in an African economy. In fact, there's a great paper about the politics of Africa and why Africa is always grouped together, whereas we don't necessarily see this with other continents. The creation of an Africa. But I won't go too much into that. That's more about my identity, curiosity about, why is it that Africa is always spoken about in a homogeneous way, whereas other continents, no matter how diverse they are named by country. Someone will say Africa, Brazil, and China. Okay, but then, Africa is not one country. So I think it's important that we look back at that. I used to work at the Mandela Institute for Development Studies. And there, one of the interests was how can we trace back and understand how African or how various groups on the African continent rather, what is that indigenous knowledge? How do we understand it differently and economically and so forth? I don't know how far they got with their projects. When I was there, it wasn't really extensive, but certainly something to look at.
This is certainly a point to come back to. I'm also watching Nigel over there biting his nails, trying to find a cue to come in and tell you his side. Nigel, ball in your court. Feel free to reply to that.
I appreciate the phenomenal answer by our guest, and we'll implore you to move on to the next section.
Thank you.
Sure, I'll move on. Okay, I think I've lost. Okay, so we just finished the first section. Yeah. So defining corruption. So we'll start with how, first of all, in 2013, the World Bank Group president declared corruption in the developing world, aka Africa and all global South, basically, as public enemy number one. Of course, corruption is ruining the youth. Corruption is ruining everything. And how the IMF and so forth define corruption, right, is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. And it's been sort of the core of its high-level anti-corruption campaign, for a very long time. But the thing is, like I said, these definitions have always been quite biased towards developing countries. And actually, like I began talking about, is Mr. Khan defines corruption as behavior which deviates from formal rules of conduct. So it depends on what the formal institutions in that country are, and then how do we define the distinction between that. So in a way, if you don't know the institutions of the country or the rule of law of the country, you cannot fly in and say this is corruption. You have to understand what is the deviation from what is the institutionalized norms, so to speak. And so in this paper, and a lot of Mr. Khan's work is around this, the types of corruption. And I'd argue that fundamentally the reason why we haven't been able to tackle or sufficiently tackle the issue of corruption is that there's always an assumption that, there's one type of corruption. And in a way, the IMF sees it as that bottom corner here, which is market restriction driven corruption, which is why they advocate for neoliberalism, right? Because they're saying that the corruption is, stopping the market from operating in its fullest potential, right? And so I'll start there with market restriction, which is I, but the numbering is a bit weird. And so, corruption associated with bypassing market restrictions. So it's really about how do you damage the barriers, right? So if you, I don't know if I'm breaking, okay. If you remove, for example, the many forms that people have to fill in to start a business, you have less corruption, right? Because people, and this is the assumption, I'm not saying I believe this today, but people are being corrupt because they're just trying to get their business registered. And so they're going to do whatever it takes to just get their business registered. And I think it's really funny that we're having this conversation today because the IMF finally decided to discontinue doing business reports, right? Because for many years, people have been telling them that it's problematic. And they finally decided that they agree that they're doing business reports is actually deeply, deeply flawed. And so the doing business, it had been stopped before, but now it's really like gone in a way, like discontinued because of the flaws. But the doing business report was critical to this market restriction kind of like driven corruption agenda, right? Because it was saying, look, your doing business score is so poor. So you need to amp up your ease of doing business so that you don't experience the corruption. Like you need to do more. And of course, now that we know, or heterodox economists have always known it's flawed, but what were countries doing? Following this prescription, right? If I do more ease of business, doing business, then I'll have seen less of this corruption. There's also policy constraining corruption. And this has to do with the distortion or evasion of necessary state functions, right? And when we say the outcomes can be positive or negative, I think sometimes it's very interesting, and I'll come to this when we come to predation, about this idea of positive versus negative. It's that if someone does a corrupt deal that benefits the majority or benefits the structure broadly, do we still see it as negative? Do the means outweigh the ends outweigh the means in a way? So it's very interesting. But it can also distort the market or the policies in a positive way, right? For example, if someone went on a policy corruption to basically ensure that in South Africa, universal basic income grant was implemented, right? Would it be corruption still? Yes. But what are the outcomes? Massively positive, right, for the majority of the population. So the question is always, and then the thing corruption is always about net effect. What is the net effect of the corrupt behavior that takes place, right? And then there's political, that was policy constraining, sorry, oops. And then there's political corruption. And political corruption is sort of, informal decisions that are necessary for political stabilization. And it has to do with the political settlement, basically who's making the decisions. And in South Africa, as you might have heard, we had this big saga with the Gupta family that basically engaged in what is called state capture. And state capture means that policies are being swayed in a particular way to enable this political settlement to grow, right? And enabling particular rules of policy to happen, and so That's the one. So that's an illegal and informal state function. And then there's predation theft, and predation theft is referring to like you bribe a police officer, like, you know, a public officer directly takes X amount of money from the budget for whatever. And so scales here also matter, right? But of course, predation and theft is also one of those. Between market restriction and predation and theft, they're usually the ones that are spoken about even more, right? Like those are the ones like, oh, if you're driving in an African city, you're gonna have to bribe people to get by. Like those are the ones that are entrenched in the public discourse. Of course, in South Africa, because of the Gupta saga, people are more aware of political corruption, right? Because it was so widely popularized and understood as something that was happening within the state, right? So that's that. And then there's illicit financial flows, you know, and that's the illegal movement of money or capital, right? And I think we all hear about this a lot, illicit financial flows, you know, tax avoidance and evasion, it goes into all of that. But why it's important is because one of the things that has been put forward is that bribery and corruption are one of the ways in which illicit financial flows are enabled. You know, so corruption in a way or not enhances, I don't want to say enhances, that's not the appropriate word, but enables illicit financial flows to move, right? When we talk about money moving from the south to the north, that's what we're talking about, you know? And as most of us have seen this is a bit outdated now, this is probably 2018, but it was estimated that about 50 billion you know, what states, African states are losing from sort of these, you know, illicit financial flows, commercial transactions, organized criminal activities, you know, and corruption, right? Because again, remember that corruption enables illicit financial flows in a particular way, right? And just this slide is just to illustrate how illicit financial flows enabled by corruption. Not all of them are enabled by corruption, because again, like I said, we live in a highly globalized financial system, where the architecture of this globalized financial system allows actually for this sort of transfer to happen, right? And so the African continent has lost a lot in illicit financial flows, right? Which is concerning, which is why also tackling corruption has to be critical, because it feeds into this broader issue of illicit financial flows. And then there's corruption in offshore accounts. Again, going back to this hyper-globalized financial system, understanding that 148 billion is lost to corruption every year, according to the African Development Bank, to offshore accounts, right? So when this money is accumulated, people are not keeping it in the economies, people are not spending it in the economy. Maybe the net effect might be positive if they did, but really they're taking it to offshore accounts, right? And so here are some more numbers there around, you know, what is happening with the offshore accounts and wealth, the transfer of wealth, and where are most of these offshore accounts? Okay, I mean, I guess except the Seychelles, but a lot of them are also in the, you know, in like the global north for the most part, right? Like including Seychelles and everyone. So critical. Then there's odious debt, which I think is to me, is a form of corruption, because odious debt is referring to external debt that has been incurred, one, without the consent of the people, two, through debt that did not benefit the people, and three, when the lender knew that this money would not benefit the people and that the citizens of that country had not consented to it. So why give that debt, right? For what use is it for if it is not for the people of that country? Then certainly that money, I'd argue, is being accumulated for, you know, corrupt activities potentially. And so that's something that, you know, civil society, at least in South Africa, has called for, the cancellation of odious debt, where lenders knew explicitly this money is not going to do what it's supposed to do, but we will lend it anyway. And odious debt, of course, has huge ramifications for future sustainability, right? Because now you, in this virtual world of debt, you have to go back, like we said, the policy externalization, now you have to increase your debt accumulation and so forth. So I'm going to stop there because I think the types of corruption themselves and illicit financial flows and offshore accounts, and how, corruption in a way moves, so to speak, or rather corruption reproduces itself, is quite extensive. And I haven't even covered all the ways in which corruption reproduces itself, right? Well, we could go into criminal activity and go like one by one, from drugs to human trafficking to, we could go through speculative financing, particularly in the South African South African context, where people are not investing actually in South Africa. All they're doing is speculating in the markets, which is creating volatility in the market itself. And I'd argue that that is, in a way, a form of corrupting the market, right? It distorts the market deeply. And that there are people, the wealthy, who are able to speculate in these markets, who walk away with massive money from having participated in that. And speaking of that, there was a major story in South Africa a couple of years ago where ABSA used to be owned by Barclays, and some of the banks were found to be colluding against the South African currency, and that was leading to massive profits for them. But of course, they walked away with a small fine, and here we are. They're still there. So good times, as always. So yeah, I'll stop there. I don't know if anyone has any questions.